So like I said, I'm going to ask you some questions you've already spoken about, but I think so that we can share these answers to people who haven't been able to go to the speeches. But my first question for you is, when when we're asking men to step up and kind of speak against the powers that we've talked about in your presentation, what do you recommend how they respond to possibly sexist response to that criticism after the fact? So when men are called these, as you called them, like the mangina, or those kind of comments, how can men respond to that?
Well, I think we need men who are just willing to persist in the face of that kind of pushback, and they just say, you're calling me names like, what are you, a 7-year-old on a playground? It's like, I'm standing up because I think that we have a big problem in this community, in this society, and I think men have an important role to play, and we need more men who have the courage and the strength and the self-confidence to stand up and stand with women as their partners and allies. And you want to call me names? Go ahead, but it's more a reflection on you than it is on me. Mm-hmm. And I would hope that there's enough adult men who are strong enough and self-confident enough that kind of bullying language and ridiculing language and minimizing language would not be enough to deter them. I mean, I often say that, boys and young men need to see adult men taking some risks, because it's not fair for adult men to expect, 16-year-olds or 20-year-old college students or, high school students to challenge their friends or to interrupt sexism as they experience it or see it, if they're not seeing their fathers or other adult men doing that with their own peer culture. And that's in a sense a challenge to adult men to step up, because you owe it to the young men to model the behavior that you want them to exhibit. Mm-hmm. But I've been doing this for a long time, and I know it gets easier when you do it. The more you do it, the easier it gets. In other words, if you're a man and you speak out and you get called names, maybe initially you might get a little bit uncomfortable, but it's like at a certain point, it's water off a duck's back.
Okay.
And there's all kinds of defenders of the toxic status quo who will jump at anybody who's trying to challenge that status quo. Mm-hmm. And I'm willing to say, and I'll say it emphatically, the status quo is completely unacceptable. The level of violence and abuse that men inflict on women, on other men, on themselves is shameful. It's embarrassing, and it's disgraceful. And our society has enormously high rates of violence. We always have. We have a violent country, and we need more men. I mean, obviously women have been at the forefront of all this, and I appreciate that. But we need more men who are willing to push back, and regardless of the pushback that we get, the negative pushback that we might get, more men who are willing to say, I'm standing with these women, and I'm standing strong as a man.
Okay, great, thank you.
Sure.
And you talk a lot in your speeches about kind of these social norms and social systems that keep the system of oppression happening. Can you speak to some of the primary social norms that you see that are having that effect?
Well, it's how we define manhood and how we socialize boys to fit into those definitions. That being a man means being, dominant over others, being emotionally unavailable, or at least emotionally illiterate other than anger. In other words, not understanding the range of our emotions, including vulnerable emotions. The idea that a real man just kind of sucks it up and just kind of deals with it, and anger is the only expression of emotion that's acceptable. The idea that we're supposed to be sexually aggressive with women. The idea that we're not supposed to be thoughtful and intellectual and introspective, because a real man wouldn't read a book. A real man wouldn't engage in these dialogues and these debates. A real man is kind of strong and silent, and all these. This is some of the ways in which, boys to this day are socialized by their parents, by the larger sort of culture. I mean, it's not obviously there's many exceptions, mm-hmm. and I know many boys and men who are much more emotionally present and literate and connected, and so it's kind of a caricature, mm-hmm. but yet we still have lots of men who manifest those kind of limited characteristics. Look at the political culture of the country. Look at the leadership at the highest levels of the country. Look at the dysfunctional masculinity at the highest levels of our political and corporate culture. I mean, really, some of the behavior of the President of the United States, powerful political figures, powerful corporate figures in the entertainment industry, in journalism, in business. This is like unbelievable. It's not really unbelievable, but on one level, it's like it does make your jaw drop a little bit. Some of these really successful men who do incredibly good work in one sense are being revealed to be incredibly limited human beings and abusive human beings in other realms, especially when it comes to their interactions with women. And I mean, it's kind of sad when you think about it.
So it sounds like one of your recommendations could be, and correct me if I'm wrong, but in addition to having these men as leaders showing and modeling for other young men, but it sounds like also promoting a little bit more emotional literacy for young men, understanding how to express more emotions than just anger.
Absolutely.
Okay.
But all this has to be built into like multi-levels in systemically, not just individually. So in schools, I mean, I talk a lot about, and I mentioned this last night, we have to have in the training of teachers, in the training of educators, they have to be understanding all of these issues, like for example, the relationship between violence in the home and violence in families and all the children, for example, who are in school, K through 12, for example, who have already experienced forms of abuse.
Yeah.
And by the way, relationally, look at, I mean, something like 20% of girls have been in a physically or sexually abusive relationship as teenagers. That's a lot of people. Something close to 50% of rape victims are raped by the age of 18, which means that in high schools, a principal of a high school is presiding over a body of students, many of whom have already experienced sexual harassment, sexual assault, relationship abuse, and yet a lot of these educators and educational administrators have no training on how do you be a leader in the educational space around this. How do you bring, not only how do you bring in programs, how do you do training for your staff? How do you, if you're a man, for example, how do you use your public platform as the principal, for example, of a high school, of a middle school? How do you, or even an elementary school, how do you use your position of influence to partner with women and not just assign and delegate responsibility to women on your staff to address these issues, but how do you do it as a man? Because the kids have to hear adult men talking about this, not just adult women. And yet there's an awful lot of good men in educational administration who have never had any training. They're kind of awkward and uncomfortable with this subject matter. That's a structural and institutional problem that can be rectified if we have the will within institutions like schools of education, graduate schools of education. I think people should be required to take courses, and it should be in the curriculum that they know how to navigate some of these subject matter areas. In other words, that students who are going to be teachers, who are going to be educational administrators, have to be acquainted with cutting edge ideas about the relationship between violence in the families and how that plays out in school culture. They need to have intersectional understanding of how racism and sexism and heterosexism kind of marble together in various ways, and there's obviously complex overlaps between those systems, racism and sexism, heterosexism, ableism. I mean, there's all kinds of issues. And I always say, you don't have to be an expert, like as a teacher or as a coach or as an educational administrator. You don't have to be an expert in this subject matter. You just have to know more than you might know now, and you need to figure out how to use whatever platform. For example, when you're writing curriculum for your school, I mean, some of this is dictated by the state, and some of it is dictated by policy at the federal level. And I appreciate that educators have all kinds of mandates, and they're often struggling to meet the conditions of. You know what I mean? It's not an easy thing to do to be an educator with all these different responsibilities and mandates, but we got to start somewhere. And we can't just be running from one individual case to the next.
Yeah, definitely.
Because that's whack-a-mole, and it doesn't work.
Yeah. And I think, you motivate me to even rethink about how our prevention efforts are. We are trying to get in curriculum, and it's just too hard. And so I like this idea of kind of reshifting our focus to swimming upstream. If we can't get into the curriculum of the schools, go to the teachers before they even get to the school system. So love that idea. Couple questions. One question I have is, oftentimes in the work that we do, we work with survivors, and due to the nature of domestic violence, these survivors are left to be single mothers who are raising young boys who are these walking wounded that you've spoken about yesterday. And so these moms are left to have these very hard conversations with very young boys. What are some maybe tips or recommendations or suggestions to a single mom who is trying to raise a young man like this?
Yeah, this is a really tough question. I mean, it's a tough subject. I think there's an awful lot of women who are doing exactly what you're saying, and I, for years and years, have had women come to my talks with their sons, and often young sons, and I think part of what they want is they want their young son to see an adult man who's not only is not abusive, but is actually calling out abuse and criticizing abuse and saying that men who are abusive have issues and problems. And so, in other words, in some cases, the fathers of these kids aren't horrible. Sometimes they are, and they might have done horrible things, but the kids often want a relationship with their father. It's complicated. I mean, I appreciate that. By the way, some boys and men don't want anything to do with the father who has been abusive to their mother and to them, and they just have nothing. They don't even want to see him ever again, which is also tragic, and I appreciate that. But others want connection, and they're struggling to, how do you maintain connection with this person who has caused so much harm to someone you care so much about, your mother and yourself and your siblings, you know. One thing I think that those mothers have, or those survivors have, is that they maybe didn't have a generation ago, is there's an awful lot of men who have talked about this subject matter. There's all kinds of films. I mean, I make films, other people make films. They can show their sons, for example, films of men, not just talking heads, but, you know, my films deal with media and the relationship between how media normalizes certain kinds of manhood, if you will. But there's all kinds of other tools that they can, like, watch with their sons, for example, and then have a dialogue. So in other words, I've known for a long time that one of the ways that a lot of college professors and high school teachers use my films, women high school teachers and college professors, is they'll bring a man into the classroom in the form of my videos, and then they'll have a dialogue about it. And it's not to say that women can't teach boys and men about masculinities without a man, but there's a difference.
Yeah.
And I think it's not just
influence. Yeah.
It's not, and it's identity issues. It's not just about information. It's not just the imparting of information. It's an experience. I think it's important for men, and boys, and young men, especially who have been traumatized, who have been experiencing violence from men, to see men who are not violent, to have dialogue with men who are not violent, in whatever way they can. It doesn't just mean interpersonally in their family or their extended networks. That's true too. But also, you know, like I said, in the educational space, on video, if they even read, I'm not sure if you can get them to read, and it's a challenge getting young people to read. But there's an awful lot of stuff that's been written that men have written about their own experiences, including, by the way, men who have grown up with abuse in their own families and who have come on the other side of it. So in other words, those young boys, that 12-year-old boy whose father was abusive to his mother, he's not alone. There's an awful lot of him out there. There's an awful lot of adult men in Spokane and everywhere else who once were that 12-year-old boy. And so one of the things is, the more men you get talking about this subject matter, including men in the room last night at my talk in Gonzaga, and tonight and today, this morning, I guarantee you there's an awful lot of stories in this room and that room of men who have come through those very same kind of situations, and who have they've never been asked to talk about their experiences. They've never been asked to mentor boys or young men through those situations because it just hasn't crossed their desk in that way. But the more men we get talking about this, the more those men will be present.
Okay. And then also, I think there's going to be some overlap of recommendations here, but as an agency, you know, we have done a lot to try to help young boys who are victims themselves of these situations to heal from that. But do you have any other recommendations as a society and a culture that's trying to help young men who have been, you know, witnesses and direct victims of this violence, how we can better support those traumatized youth to try to prevent that cycle of them potentially becoming abusive in their future?
They need to be in therapy.
Okay.
I think that's the single most important thing, is that they need to be encouraged to seek help or to get help. That it's not an act of weakness, it's actually an act of strength and self-care and responsibility, not weakness. I think we have to defeat the stereotype that a man or a young man who needs help is somehow soft or weak.
It's the strongest thing you can do.
Right, exactly. It's the strongest thing you can do. There's an awful lot of men out there pretending that they've got it under control, and they don't.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because they don't have the strength to come forward and say, I need help.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think the strongest thing one of the strongest things we can do as adults is say to those young men that there are people out there who can help you,
mm-hmm.
and that if you're willing to take the risk of, taking down the barrier, the hard shell that you've created, if that's what you've created, maybe not, but some guys, even at a young age, have created this armor
mm-hmm.
around themselves. And it's defensive, and I appreciate that. I was there too, and I still am in some ways, but you'll benefit so greatly from that effort, and everybody who cares about you will benefit from that.
Definitely.
And then as you grow older, if you decide that you want to have your own family, you'll be a much better parent and partner. If you've had if you've taken the steps to address your own growth in a positive way. So I think we need to encourage men to seek help and to accept help, and that it's not any indication of your being less than a man, and including, by the way, a lot of men who walk around like they're really, I've got it handled. A lot of those men do not have it handled.
Yeah.
Let's just be clear.
Yeah. Life is hard.
Life is hard, and the pretense of invulnerability is just that. It's a pretense. It's fake. It's false. Everybody's vulnerable. And by the way, you go to an AA meeting, Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, it's one space, or a Narcotics Anonymous meeting, an NA meeting. It's one space where you'll see adult men in public, if you will, acknowledge their loss of control, their sadness, their disappointment, their grief, and they won't be ridiculed for it. They'll be supported for it. And I also often point out, you know what? If you look at the number of United States military veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan who have come back over the past 17 years, traumatized, it's a huge number.
Yeah.
And there are women who are traumatized too, but it's disproportionately men because of the military is disproportionately men. These are warriors. These are the toughest, and they are themselves traumatized.
Yeah.
So the idea that somehow it's soft to be vulnerable, or it's soft or weak to be acknowledging you need some help, is just an antiquated and discredited idea that should be on the ash heap of history. That's what
Especially in a world where we've been able to create different therapeutic interventions that are not as talk therapy based, but of course I'm an EMDR therapist, so I'm such a proponent of
somatic
offering
therapies.
Types of therapies that allow people to process the trauma without having to talk about it in a way that is stereotypically still not as acceptable for males. And so
That's right.
My little plug for EMDR,
No,
of course.
Totally, I'm with you. And the trauma research, it's clear that the body keeps the score.
Yeah, definitely. And so kind of healing that deeper level of trauma. And I guess my final question is just reiterating again of asking you of what's your number one kind of your 1 minute elevator speech to men who are still very scared to speak up against power? Maybe they're still in work cultures that really breed sexism. What do you say to those men in a quick kind of sum up of what they could do? The takeaway.
No, it's a great question. People can only do what they can do, and they can, take it one step at a time. You don't have to become, this, giant activist overnight. It can be as simple as telling your friend who just told a rape joke, that's not funny. You know what I mean? And each time it gets easier. So I would say keep it within your comfort zone, but then think about pushing yourself, a little bit more, a little bit going out of your comfort zone, and then think about how your your sense of yourself either is in alignment with or unaligned with your actions. So if you see yourself as a good person, as a strong person, as a person of integrity who doesn't like injustice and doesn't feel comfortable with people mistreating each other, is what you're doing consistent with your belief that you're a good person who doesn't want to accept injustice? And then figure out how you can align your sense of who you are and who you want to be with your actions. I mean, I often say, for example, when I teach bystander stuff, which is, challenging and interrupting your friends or peers who are either evidencing attitudes or certainly behaviors that are abusive in some fashion. Ultimately, to me, what motivates me, and I think some others, is not what other people's opinion of me is, because some people are going to support, if I challenge or interrupt, some people are going to support that, other people are going to be like, what are you talking about, or why did you stick your nose in that person's business, or there's going to be different ways that people respond, some positive, some negative. But ultimately, to me, what's more important is how I feel about myself and how I feel about my own actions, and are my actions consistent with my sense of who I am. And if I can, with integrity, say that I'm acting in the world in a way that I think is what I aspire to, then whether people support me or criticize me is less important than whether I know that I'm doing what I know is right. And and everybody has to make a determination for themselves what that is and what that means, and you go from there.
Okay, great, thank you.